I arrived in Abbeville, Alabama, on a late October evening. The air was crisp, the kind that makes your breath visible, and the town was eerily quiet. I had been driving for hours, chasing a story that had all but consumed me for the past few months. As a freelance journalist with a penchant for the paranormal, I'd heard countless tales, but none had gripped me quite like the legend of Huggin Molly. I checked into a small, aging motel on the outskirts of town. The receptionist, an elderly woman with a face as wrinkled as a dried apple, eyed me suspiciously when I asked about Huggin Molly. Her lips thinned into a tight line, and she simply handed me the key without a word. The room was modest, the decor straight out of the 1970s, but I was too exhausted to care. I dropped my bags and collapsed onto the bed, staring at the ceiling and wondering what I had gotten myself into. The next morning, I headed to the local library. The librarian, Mrs. Davis, was a pleasant woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back into a neat bun and eyes that twinkled with curiosity. When I mentioned Huggin Molly, her expression changed, a shadow passing over her face. Huggin Molly, she said quietly, is a legend as old as Abbeville itself. Some say she was a grieving mother who lost her child. Others believe she was a witch. Whatever the truth, she haunts our town, especially on cold nights like these. She led me to the archives, where I spent hours poring over old newspapers and town records. The stories were varied, but consistent in their chilling details. A ghostly figure dressed in black, chasing children and giving them bone-crushing hugs. Some accounts spoke of children who were never the same after their encounter, their spirits broken by the ghost's embrace. As the sun began to set, Mrs. Davis handed me a worn leather-bound book. "This is a collection of personal accounts from the townsfolk," she said. "It might give you more insight." That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing whispers in the wind, and the old motel room seemed to creak and groan with every gust. Around midnight I decided to take a walk to clear my head. The streets were deserted. The only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. I wandered aimlessly, lost in thought, until I found myself near the edge of town. The moon cast an eerie glow over the landscape, and I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me. That's when I felt it, a sudden chill, like ice water running down my spine. I turned around, and there she was, Huggin Molly. She stood about 50 feet away, a tall, shadowy figure dressed in black, her eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away slowly, but she moved with surprising speed. Before I knew it, she was inches from me, her icy breath on my face. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her arms wrapped around me, and I felt the crushing weight of her hug. It was as if she was trying to squeeze the life out of me. My vision blurred, and I struggled to break free, but her grip was unyielding. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. When I looked up, she was gone, leaving only the cold night and an overwhelming sense of dread. The next day, I sought out more locals to hear their stories. One by one, they recounted their own encounters with Huggin Molly, each tale more harrowing than the last. I met Sarah, a middle-aged woman who had grown up in Abbeville. She remembered her encounter with Molly vividly, describing the sensation of being hugged by an unseen force as a child. "I was walking home from my friend's house," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "It was late, and I knew I should have been home before dark. Suddenly, I felt this icy chill, and then arms around me, squeezing so tight I couldn't breathe. When I was finally able to break free, I ran home as fast as I could. My parents said I was just imagining things, but I knew what I felt." Another local, Mr. Thompson, a grizzled old man with a face like worn leather, recounted a similar experience. "Back when I was a boy," he said, "we used to dare each other to go out at night and see if we could find her. One night I did, and I wish I hadn't. That hug. It felt like she was trying to crush the soul right out of me." As I listened to their stories, I realized that Huggin Molly was more than just a ghost story. She was a part of the town's fabric, a dark thread woven into its history. Determined to uncover the truth, I decided to visit the old cemetery on the outskirts of town. It was said that Huggin Molly's grave was there, though no one had ever been able to find it. Armed with a flashlight and the leather-bound book Mrs. Davis had given me, I made my way through the overgrown graveyard. The night was deathly silent. The only sound was the crunch of my footsteps on the fallen leaves. I wandered among the tombstones, some so old the inscriptions had worn away, until I found a secluded corner. There, partially hidden by a tangle of vines, was a headstone that looked different from the rest. I cleared away the vegetation and shone my flashlight on the inscription. It read, "Molly Crenshaw, beloved mother, taken too soon." My heart raced as I realized I had found her grave. The book had mentioned Molly Crenshaw, a woman who had lost her child under mysterious circumstances. Could this be Huggin Molly? As I stood there, I felt the temperature drop suddenly. My breath fogged in the air, and I knew I was not alone. I turned slowly, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and there she was again. This time her eyes glowed brighter, and I could see the sadness etched into her ghostly face. She moved towards me, and I braced myself for the crushing hug, but instead she stopped a few feet away, her eyes pleading. It was as if she was trying to communicate something, but I couldn't understand. Then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she vanished, leaving me alone in the darkness. Back at the motel, I pored over the book, searching for clues. There was a passage that caught my eye, a letter written by Molly Crenshaw herself. It spoke of her grief over losing her child and her desire to protect other children from the same fate. Could it be that Huggin Molly wasn't a malevolent spirit, but a guardian of sorts? The next morning, I visited Mrs. Davis again, sharing my findings. She listened intently, her expression thoughtful. "Perhaps Molly's spirit is trapped," she said, "bound by her grief and unable to move on." Together, we devised a plan. That night, I returned to the cemetery, this time with Mrs. Davis. We brought flowers and a candle, creating a small memorial at Molly's grave. As we stood there, the air grew cold, and once again, Huggin Molly appeared. But this time there was no fear. Her ghostly form seemed to soften, and for a moment I saw a glimpse of the woman she once was, a grieving mother, lost and alone. We stood in silence, offering our respects, and slowly her form began to fade. There was a sense of peace in the air, a release of the tension that had gripped the town for so long. In the days that followed, the stories of Huggin Molly became less frequent. The townsfolk felt a sense of relief, as if a dark cloud had lifted. I stayed in Abbeville for a few more weeks, documenting the change and speaking with the locals. The sense of fear that had once permeated the town was replaced with a cautious optimism. Before I left, I visited Molly's grave one last time. The flowers we had left were still there, a small token of our gratitude. As I stood there, I felt a gentle breeze, and for a brief moment, I thought I heard a whisper of thanks. I drove away from Abbeville with a sense of accomplishment. I had come looking for a ghost story and found something much deeper, a tale of loss, grief, and ultimately peace. Huggin Molly would always be a part of Abbeville's history, but now she could rest. Years later, I still think about Huggin Molly. The story became one of my most popular articles, sparking interest in paranormal enthusiasts and skeptics alike. I received countless letters from readers who had their own tales of ghostly encounters, but none quite like Molly's. Every October, I make a trip back to Abbeville. The town has changed over the years, but the memory of Huggin Molly remains. I visit her grave, leaving flowers and a candle, a small gesture to honor the spirit that once haunted the town. And each time, as I stand in that old cemetery, I feel a sense of connection to the past. Huggin Molly may have been a ghost, but in her own way, she brought the town together. She reminded us of the power of love, even in death, and the importance of remembering those who came before us. As I drive away, the wind whispers through the trees, and I like to think that somewhere Molly is at peace, her spirit finally free. Thank you for tuning in. Please leave a like and subscribe. I will see you again next week.